Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to those of you who are joining from Europe or Africa. I am Manola from the WWF Global Palm Oil team based in Singapore, and I will be your host for today. On behalf of WWF, I'd like to welcome all of you to this very first event of our palm oil webinar series, which is a four-part online series in which we will take a closer look at challenges and solutions for the palm oil industry in Asia. This first session will uncover the latest and most significant palm oil trade and consumption patterns across the region. And we will also discuss the many opportunities that stakeholders along the palm oil supply chain have at their disposal to take ambitious action for sustainability. So before we begin today's session, I'd like to draw your attention to a few housekeeping matters. First of all, please note that all attendees will automatically be on mute. This being said, we will be happy to address any questions you may have via the Q&A function, and please be sure to as well make use of the chat function to interact with us and amongst each other. Please note that this webinar is also being recorded, and the recording will be shared with all of you post-event, together with the research that our speakers will be presenting and discussing today. So for today's agenda, So for today's agenda, we have a pretty packed agenda, actually. A number of experts from across the WWF network will be joining us to provide regional and country level insights. We will first kick off this webinar with some brief opening remarks, and then we will dive right into the main focus of this session, which will provide a sneak peek of two studies that WWF has recently commissioned. The first presentation will provide key insights on trade flows from major palm oil production landscapes in Asia. And the second presentation will unpack new data on palm oil consumption trends in 5 key Asian markets. Please note that both presentations will actually have dedicated Q&A sessions, so there will be plenty of time for you to interact. Finally, we will close this session with a panel discussion, during which our panelists will share their perspective on what it will take to boost the uptake of sustainable palm oil in Asia and what that actually looks like in practice. I would now like to welcome Michael Gwyndon, who is the WWF Global Palm Oil Lead, to deliver the opening remarks. So Michael, if you could unmute and turn on your video, please, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Manola, and welcome everyone to the opening session of our palm oil webinar series. Next slide, Manola. I think, as most of us are aware, palm oil is an ingredient that has tremendous relevance in our daily lives. It's the world's most produced, consumed, and traded vegetable oil. And it's found in countless products, so things like packaged foods, cosmetics, cleaning products. It's used as an ingredient in animal feed, and also as a biofuel. And much of the world's production is concentrated in 2 producing countries, specifically Indonesia and Malaysia, accounting for approximately 85% of the world's palm oil production. And more than half of the world's palm oil, or around 61%, is consumed within Asia. And this is really only expected to grow in the coming years, as demand for palm oil is projected to increase by as much as 6-fold in the next 30 years. Which I think really highlights the relevance of today's conversation. And today we really want to shed light on the role of Asia in transitioning to a more responsible and sustainable palm oil sector, and also talk about some of the opportunities for action. And very briefly, just talking about some of the impacts of palm oil. So when we think of palm oil, I think we're often confronted with images and stats about some of the environmental and social impacts. And these include things like tropical deforestation, with agriculture being estimated to account for approximately 80% of tropical deforestation. It's also a key threat to the range of endangered and vulnerable species. So these include species such as orangutans, elephants, rhinos, and tigers. And this graph on the screen here is actually taken from our Living Planet report that we published last year. And this is showing that populations of wildlife have declined by on average 68% since 1970. And clearing land for agriculture development is also responsible for haze across Southeast Asia and releases large amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and in turn fueling climate change. And palm oil production also often occurs at the expense of the rights and interests of local communities and indigenous people. And these are all very real problems that need to be tackled. But today I'd also like to take some time to reflect and celebrate some of the key achievements that we've made over the years in the region. And this includes, first of all, if you look at RSPO membership, so the largest palm oil certification body globally within Asia, so specifically in Singapore, China, Indonesia, India, and Malaysia. We've seen membership grow substantially within the RSPO over recent years, with over 600 members currently present across these 5 countries. And governments and producer countries have also made concerted efforts to tackle sustainability challenges in the industry. This includes in places such as Sabah, where the government has actually made a commitment to achieve 100% RSPO certification by 2025 through the jurisdictional approach. And a lot of studies have also shown that consumer awareness and demand for sustainable palm oil across the region has increased in recent years. And just a few stats that I would like to share on the screen. Just click, Manila. So just a few stats to sort of put this in context. So we've done some research within WWF on some of these issues, and within Singapore, for example, we've our survey has shown that around 60% of consumers are aware of sustainability issues within the palm oil sector. Public awareness on palm oil and deforestation within China has actually increased from 7% in 2019 to 31% in 2020. And online searches for sustainable goods within Indonesia have increased by 24% over the past 5 years. And lastly, we've also seen the emergence of several national and regional demand side alliances in the region. So things like the India Sustainable Palm Oil Coalition and the China Sustainable Palm Oil Alliance, among others. And these are really bringing together various stakeholders to work collectively to tackle sustainability issues within the palm oil sector. And these examples and countless others really show that together we can solve some of the most pressing issues within the sector. This doesn't mean that there's not a long way still to go towards achieving 100% sustainable palm oil across the region. But these examples really provide me hope that together we will get there. And on that note, today we'd really, we hope to have a very thought-provoking discussion and talk about some new research that WWF has commissioned and will be publishing quite soon to better understand some of the key actors, sectors, and players within the palm oil industry, and to have a conversation about some of the opportunities across the region to help support the transition to a more responsible and sustainable palm oil sector. And on that note, I'd like to hand it back over to my colleagues at WWF that are working across the region to share not only some insights from this research that we will be publishing shortly, but also to share some of their experiences working across these markets. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those compelling opening remarks, Michael. And we will now move on to the next section of our webinar. And on this note, I would like to invite Oktianto Bagus Indra Kusuma, who is the WWF Palm Oil Senior Engagement Manager. Bagus will be presenting the key findings of a study which maps out palm oil trade flows from 6 priority landscapes in Asia. So Bagus, if you could please unmute and turn on your video, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Manola, and good morning, everyone. Well, good afternoon, everyone, actually, and good morning to our colleagues in Europe and Africa. Thank you very much for joining our webinar, and thank you for taking out time to join us. So today I will be taking you through a sneak peek of our upcoming study on trade flows across key priority landscapes in Indonesia and Malaysia. As Michael presented before, Indonesia and Malaysia are key palm oil producing countries that account about 85% of the global palm oil production. And through this presentation, we will be taking you through the trade flows across the landscapes. Next slide, please. So just a brief introduction, and as most of you know this, the global palm oil supply chain is highly complex, and traceability has been one of the most challenging issues for managing supply chains. And as companies and stakeholders may often ask themselves, why is this very challenging? And there's several layers of complexity attached to this. So firstly, it's harvested fresh fruit bunches change hands many times between different stakeholders, between the plantation and mill levels before being mixed, sorted, and shipped across the globe. Secondly, supply chains span across multiple countries and involves an ever-diversifying range of stakeholders. Lastly, sometimes the origins and associated environmental impacts of palm oil supplies are unknown by the time they're used in consumer goods, such as your cooking oils, your chocolates, and cosmetics. So to that end, WWF commissioned the study to identify trade flows from the 6 priority landscapes. And the methodology that we used actually is based on publicly available data and import and export data that was acquired for the study. We used 2 approaches. Firstly, which is direct tracing. For instances where data was available and there was evidence of a strong link between supply chain actors, we were able to identify the direct traces. But for instances where we had limited access to data, we used a risk-based tracing or risk-based approach to identify the probability of sourcing from a particular supply chain actor or landscape. It is also important to note that the study highlights companies' links to sourcing to these landscapes and not implying links of deforestation. But these landscapes hold some of the richest and most biodiverse tropical forests on the planet, giving shelter to many rare species and providing livelihoods for millions of people. And in the next slide, I will provide you an overview of the 6 different landscapes. Next slide, please, Manola. And if you see, WWF commissioned the study to model trade flows from 6 priority landscapes that are at a high risk of deforestation and ecosystem conversion. And we mapped these trade flows, and as you can see on the left side, the 6 landscapes are Lower Sugut, Tawau, and Tabin in Malaysia, and in Indonesia, the Tesonilo, the Sintang, and the South Papua landscapes. And from the landscapes areas, we're able to identify the concessions that were linked to these landscapes, the mills, the refineries, and also the other downstream facilities. So what were the key insights that we wanted to draw from the studies? Firstly, identify what are the key companies that are exposed to or linked to these landscapes, be it the producers, the traders, and the buyers. Then identify what their level of exposure to these priority landscapes are, and what is their likelihood of sourcing palm oil from these areas. And accordingly, what are the recommendations that we have and opportunities for action that companies can take? And in Sabah, for example, or from Malaysia, if you take the example of Malaysia, Tabin has a very large supply base, and we estimated that about 6.8 million tons of FFB and 660,000 tons of CPO was produced per year. And that is about nearly half of the palm oil coming from these 3 landscapes. And what we did was to model the trade flows, we used figures from GIGA, or the Global Yield Gap Atlas, to estimate the tons of FFB per year based on the plantations or the mature area, and the oil extraction rates for estimating CPO per year coming out from these landscapes. And in Indonesia, if you see, Sintang is also a very highly complex landscape with a lot of stakeholders. Same way with Tesonilo, because in Tesonilo landscape, we do identify there are a lot of smallholders and a lot of plantations within the park boundaries. Whereas in South Papua, it's a region for high risk of deforestation, and we identified a total of 28 concessions, but only 18 were active. The next slide, please. And now we zoom in to trade flows in the Sabah landscapes. And I'd like to draw your attention to the upper left diagram. And as you can see, FGV Holding has the largest planted area across the three priority landscapes in Sabah and accounts for more than a quarter of the total planted area, which is 26.7% roughly. And also there were other producer groups that were identified in these landscapes. And these were mostly smaller producer groups. Same way, if you look at the mills owned by FGV Holdings and Wilmar have the highest exposure. While if you look at the refinery level, Wilmar and KLK refinery source the largest CPO volumes from the landscape, particularly from Tabin. And we used Sankey diagrams. And if you look at the diagram below, for Sabah, we used the Sankey diagrams to map the trade flows of different supply chain actors and their level of exposure to the landscapes. And for Sabah, we've mapped it a little differently. So we mapped it from the landscapes to the ports and refiners. Reason we did this is there are a large number of small corporate groups of concessions and mills. For the simplification, we have represented it onto the ports and the refinery levels. The next question would be, why is it from the port and not to the refinery levels? Well, due to the limited access or limited data that we had, we were not able to estimate the total figures for each refinery, but we were able to estimate the total figures at the port level. So as you can see, we were able to identify at the port level and link that to the refineries. And the interesting point that I would like to highlight is the RSPO uptake in these landscapes varied considerably. So in our study, we found that 42% of the supply base in Tawau is RSPO certified, while in Lower Sugut and Tabin, 20% of the supply base was RSPO certified. Now, when we move on to the Indonesian landscapes and we take a closer look, or before that, if we look at the exports, next slide, Manola. And when we look at the exports out of Sabah, we estimated that 27% of Sabah's exports originates from three priority landscapes. We identified the import destinations, as you can see, and the ports of origin from the Sabah landscapes and key buyers in these countries at a risk of sourcing from these landscapes. And as you can see in the figure, and one that particularly you could see is China has quite a high level of exposure. This is due to the high volumes or dependency of volumes that are being sourced from the Sabah landscape. This is followed by the Netherlands, US, and Philippines. Due to the limited import data, we were not able to identify the buyers for Japan, South Korea, Singapore, and the Netherlands. But this does show areas where further transparency may be required in order to identify risks of sourcing for from these landscapes for these countries, and also for companies in these countries to identify whether they have a footprint in these landscapes. And in the next slide, we now take a look at the Indonesian landscape, and we take a look at the Teso Nilo landscape. And as you can see, through a representation of the Sankey diagram, first of all, the mature area, based on our analysis, and of course the EOF's investigative report, there are plantations that were found to be in and around the Teso Nilo National Park, as well as smallholders that were outside of the large private concessions. So we identified around 11 large private concessions. And for smallholders, specifically, we utilized the RIA provincial reporting on smallholder plantation areas. So most of the mature area in Teso Nilo landscape belonged to smallholders or plantations in and around the Teso Nilo Park. Other companies or corporate groups such as Wilmar, RGE Group, and Siak Raya Group also own major concessions, as you can see in the diagram at the top. But no plantations in the landscapes were found to be RSPO certified based on our study. The mills owned by the RGE Group, as you can see in the diagram, have the largest supply base from the priority landscapes, followed by Gama plantations and Peputra. So large and significant portions also came from other smaller corporate groups, and they have been classified as others because there are a lot of groups that comprise this category. And at the refinery level, majority of CPO and RBD volumes from the landscapes can be traced to refineries owned by the 5 groups, including Epigol, Wilmar, KLK, HSA Group, and Musimas. So the palm oil is processed to RBD and CPO at the refineries, and they had varying levels of exposure to the landscape. And if you refer to the diagram below, and as a buyer, you would like to identify how you interpret that, is you can understand the level of exposure to the landscapes by identifying the exporter and the port you're sourcing from. An example that I could give is, say you're sourcing from Permata Hijau Group and you're sourcing RBD from the Dumai port. So 22.6% of the total volumes processed by the group comes from the priority landscape or is exposed to the priority landscapes, which means as a buyer, there's a 22% chance that your RBD you source originates from the landscapes. And so that is how we have estimated. And in the next slide, when we look, and you can also, of course, apply this with the other groups as well. In the next slide, when you look at the export, Dumai plays a very crucial role. So our analysis found that Dumai is a very crucial port in terms of handling about 42% of the Indonesian international exports of palm oil products. Due to its geographic proximity to Singapore, palm oil products were re-exported to different markets through Singapore. The port is also important with respects to links to the Tesonilo landscapes. So 82% of the estimated 467,000 tons of palm oil produced from the landscapes goes to the Dumai port. And you can understand and see how significant flows from this port is and how that links to different buyers across the world. And as you can see there are some of the biggest importing countries that have a high exposure to the landscapes. For example, if we look at Singapore, the different traders, the different ports, and the different key buyers that are at a risk of sourcing from these landscapes or exposed to these landscapes. And next slide, we move on to the Sintang landscape. So first of all, as you can see in the producer columns, Lyman Agro is the largest producer in the Sintang priority landscape, and it accounts for more than a quarter of the total mature oil palm area, which is 28%. And mills, if you trace the palm oil that flows from Lyman Agro and also from the others, you could see that the largest volumes of palm oil from the landscapes also go to mills owned by Lyman Agro. And there are also other smaller corporate groups that account for a significant portion, that is 37% of the total mature palm oil areas. There are other key producers in the Sintang landscape as well, such as GAR, Inkasiraya, Everbright, and Evershine. And at the refinery level, you could see that Sinarmas, BLD Plantation, and Wilmar are the 3 largest refineries, together accounting for about 90% of the palm oil volumes from Sintang. In this case, if we look at CPO coming out from Dumai and Nangga Badao ports, the exposure to the landscape is at 100%, and you can see that in the figure below. Next slide. And if we look at the exports out of Sintang, again, Dumai plays a very crucial role and handles approximately 51% of the estimated 411,000 tons of palm oil produced in the Sintang landscape. While the land crossing in Nangga Badao handles about 43% of volumes coming from the Sintang landscapes. Exports from the priority landscapes could be traced to several countries such as Malaysia, Singapore, China, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and the US, although a large share was not traceable due to limited information. So buyers as you can see in the diagram, buyers in Malaysia and Singapore are highly exposed to the landscapes. And these include volumes to buyers such as Kirana Palm Oil Refinery, SOP Edible Oil, JPY Trading and Services through the Nangga Badao land crossing. So you could see there is a significant amount of volumes from that land crossing to these refineries. While Singapore buyers through traders Sinarmas and Wilmar through the port of Dumai and Tarahan are also exposed to the landscapes. And next slide, we move on to the final landscape, which is the South Papua landscape. So as I mentioned before, palm oil development in Papua is very recent, and at the start it was very slow to develop, but has picked up pace since 2008. So as lands for plantations in Sumatra and Kalimantan become more scarce, Papua has emerged as the next frontier for palm oil expansion. So it is an important frontier for forest protection as well, to ensure that our supply chain is not involved in deforestation in particularly South Papua, because there is a high risk that for conversion of these natural ecosystems. And in the study, we identified that there were a total of 28 concessions in South Papua, but only 18 actually showed evidence of having productive areas at the time of the study. And as you can see, Corindo was found to be the largest producer, owning more than half of the total mature oil palm area in the landscapes. When we move on to the mills, there are 6 mills in the South Papua landscapes, 4 that are owned by Corindo and 2 owned by POSCO. The 2 South Korean companies are closely linked, with Corindo managing POSCO plantations and mills. And we also estimate that about 25% of the CPO production from the South Papua landscape was exported internationally, suggesting that 75 might have been consumed or routed domestically first. And just quickly, if we look at the exports on the next slide, the ports of Asike, Bade, and Irian Jaya are key points of export for palm oil from the South Papua landscapes. And some of the key exporters include Bumi Indawa Niaga from the Corindo Group, and also BIA from the POSCO Corindo Group. And the same shippers also exported some CPO volumes from the landscapes to the port of Belawan and Dumai. So palm oil originating from the South Papua Pride landscape was traced to markets in India, South Korea, and Singapore, and from Singapore likely re-exported. So based on our analysis, the buyers at high risk include 3F Industries and Imami Agrotech in India, along with POSCO International in South Korea and AgriTrade International in Singapore. So moving on to the last bit of the slides is, if you see a link to these landscapes, and what can you do to mitigate these risks? And as a company, what can you do, and what are the steps you can take? So first of all, there are some things that you could take in your supply chain, the steps you could take in your supply chain, the steps you could take beyond your supply chain. What are the steps you can take for transparency? And also, what are some of the recommendations for national and local governance as well? So firstly, what can you do in your own supply chain? The first thing is having the commitment for deforestation, conversion, and human rights issues. So being deforestation, conversion, and human rights free. And once you have that sort of commitment, it's having time-bound action plans. And time-bound action plans to source towards 100% RSPO certified sustainable palm oil or POIC verified oil. So basically having a time frame in mind on when you plan to meet your commitments. And certification is, of course, one of the tools to get you there, one of the many tools to get you there. Thirdly, once you have the commitment, once you have an action and time-bound plan, it's ensuring that your suppliers are deforestation, conversion, and human rights free. And that way, it's like requiring or purchasing from suppliers that have these policies in place. And lastly, it's establishing robust monitoring and verification systems to ensure that your suppliers are in compliance with your commitments. And the next step is, what can you do beyond the supply chain? First of all, it's collaborating with stakeholders to implement sustainable land use practices. That's really important. You need to collaborate in order to move forward. And secondly, it's supporting policy action in producer and consumer countries for sustainable palm oil. And also be more proactive in the third point, which is participating in action-oriented initiatives and advocating for sustainable palm oil. And lastly, what can you do as a company is invest in on-the-ground projects, either that be forest conservation, livelihood development, or even supporting smallholders. And in the last slide, if we look at the recommendations for traceability, and transparency traceability, first of all, to identify where your palm oil is coming from, you need to require your suppliers to have traceability or visibility towards the plantation level and to the FFB level. Once you have that sort of visibility, it's about monitoring and managing those environmental and social risks. Once you're able to identify that, and then you're able to move forward with your sustainability journey, it's about using standardized, accepted, and technically sound reporting systems, such as the Global Reporting Initiative and the Accountability Framework Initiative, where it is possible that you would like to communicate your progress to stakeholders. And if you have a standard template to report the progress, to report information, you use it in a standard manner. And once you want to make that information readily available, report the progress at least annually using these systems. There are also recommendations for national and local governments. First of all, it's strengthening and enforcing laws and policies that prohibit deforestation, conversion, and human rights abuses. Secondly, promoting and adopting landscape and jurisdictional approaches. Third is supporting and incentivizing palm oil producers, including smallholders, so they adapt more responsible and sustainable production practices. And lastly, as I mentioned before, collaboration is key. And for governments, collaborating with different stakeholders to increase transparency across the palm oil sector. And this would mean either through concession maps, making that available, or requiring companies to publish traceability data. With that, I would like to conclude that in an era of technological advancements, transparency and collaboration is a key step towards bringing the palm oil industry forward. And together we can work towards finding ways to resolve these issues on the ground. So thank you very much. Now we move on to the questions. There is a question which asks, are you able to link the trade flows between palm oil millers and millers that are not related to bigger groups? In some of the studies that we went through, we noticed that this was the case. So what we have actually done is we've classified them into a category of others. And so that is why they have been categorized separately, because they're small millers or small mills that had very trace amounts or trace volumes flowing through the landscapes. If we represented it, it would have been quite complex in the way we had to break that down for representation purposes, but they have been classified under the group of others. Another question is, what are the feasible recommendations for small palm oil mills that have less financial support and capacity and or group of smallholders? As we learned that smallholders also have a majority of supplies. Like it or not, the sustainable also should include them. And definitely that is a very good question, and I agree with you. And that is why in one of our recommendations that we propose for companies, especially to collaborate and work on the ground to invest in these landscapes, such as providing support for smallholders, increasing and enhancing their capacity. And in case of companies that don't have that sort of capacity, providing that sort of technical assistance to be able to comply with the sustainability commitments that the big groups or even the different companies have made. I think since we have very limited time, we need to move on to the session, next session. So I would like to give the floor back to Manola, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Bagus, for that insightful presentation. I would like to now move on to the next section, which will focus on palm oil consumption trends, which will be presented by Mylan Huang, who is our palm oil engagement manager. Mylan, I invite you to unmute yourself, put on your video, and also share your screen.
Thank you very much, Manola, and a very good morning, good afternoon to everyone. I'm just gonna share my slide first. So I hope that you all can see the screen that I'm showing.
Yes, it's fine, Mylan.
Okay, great. So thanks everyone again for joining in today's webinar. I'm very glad to be here to share with you the key findings of our consumption study. But before I go into the detail, let me just briefly touch upon the background as well as the methodology of the study. So as Michael highlighted earlier, Asia plays a very important role in the supply chain of palm oil. It is home to the world's largest producers, and at the same time is also a large consumer of the commodity. And therefore, the region is uniquely positioned to drive meaningful impact in the industry. However, there is currently limited market intelligence on palm oil consumption in Asia, as well as the existing level of sustainable palm oil uptake. And that motivated WWF to commission this study to provide more insights into the current state of consumption in Asia with a focus on 5 key markets: China, India, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore. Our study used a combination of publicly available databases, modeling estimates by our consultant, Sergey Anam, as well as industry interviews with our industry experts. And with that, let me now jump into the major findings of the study. So first of all, looking at the volume of palm oil consumption, our data shows that the 5 markets are major consumers of the commodity. Together, they accounted for about half of the palm oil and palm kernel oil consumption in 2019. And across the 5 markets, we can see that Indonesia, while being the largest producer, is also the largest consumer of the commodity. Just a note that in our study, when we talk about consumption, that includes both industrial and household consumption. So driven by consumption, it is unsurprising that there's a large volume of palm oil imported into these markets, with India accounted for about 17% of the global import value of key palm products in 2019, and China accounted for about 14%. Interestingly, when palm-related products are included, China overtakes India to be the largest importer. We also saw an increasing trend in imports of palm products into these countries, indicating an increase in demand for the commodity. Now, while our study did not distinguish between end products that are consumed domestically versus those that are exported to other markets, we found that the majority of palm products imported into China and India is to serve the domestic markets, whereas the palm imports into Malaysia and Singapore capture a large share of industrial consumption, and that reflects the value-added transformation of palm oil into intermediate or finished goods, which are then re-exported across the world. So the next slide shows the breakdown of palm oil consumption by application sector. At the regional level, cooking oil and fat remains the largest sector, accounting for more than 40% of the consumption volume across the 5 markets. At the country level, we can see that palm oil is most commonly used as cooking oil in China, India, and Indonesia. And at the same time, it is also widely used for biofuel and energy production in Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore. So the biofuel used in Indonesia and Malaysia is mostly from the transportation sector, whereas in Singapore, it is mainly used by fuel processors. Moving on, so we were able to obtain a more detailed breakdown of the cooking oil and fat sector for 2 countries, China and India, where this is the largest application sector. For China, our data shows that instant noodle is the largest segment, accounting for more than 40% of the consumption volume, and catering comes in second. For India, however, it was the edible oil market is more opaque, so it was more challenging for us to obtain a breakdown. However, we found that palm oil used by households and catering services accounted for more than 60% of the total consumption volume within this sector. Palm oil is usually blended with other types of oil for household consumption in India, and it is also a preferred cooking oil by catering services due to its low price. So far we've talked about the role of Asia in driving the demand for palm oil. The next question is, how much of that is currently sustainable? Now, to answer that question, we estimated that about 3 to 4% of the consumption across the 5 markets is currently RSPO certified. Considering that, the 19% of the world's production is RSPO certified, there is a large opportunity to improve uptake in the region. The level of RSPO uptake also varies by country, that you can see here. So we have Singapore and Malaysia leading the way at about 10% of consumption. China is in the middle of the pack at about 4 to 7%, while India and Indonesia have lower levels of uptake. In addition, when we looked at the supply chain model used, mass balance appears to be the most predominant model across all, which consistently represents more than half of the RSPO volume purchased across the 5 markets. So putting all of this fighting together, what does it mean for us, and how can we increase the uptake of sustainable palm oil going forward in Asia? Well, there are several steps that we can take. First of all, collective efforts are needed to create impactful change. Both multinational and local companies need to take action. For MNCs, many companies have actually made commitments to purchase 100% RSPO certified palm oil. So it is very important for them to follow through on the existing commitment, because at the same time, there's also a lack of transparency with regard to how these commitments apply to their Asian operations. So it's very important for them to make sure that they implement the commitments across all countries that they operate in. And our modeling estimate shows that this could lead to an increase of 5% in the level of RSPO uptake across the 5 markets. Now, for regional and local companies, the first step is for them to start sourcing sustainable palm oil. Our estimate shows that if the top 10 to 20 largest buyers in the region were to take up our RSPO certified palm oil, this could add another 5% to the overall RSPO uptake in the region. So as an immediate next step, companies can start sourcing certified palm oil by purchasing book and claim credits before gradually transitioning into other physical supply chain models. So what are some of the key sectors that we should focus on to maximize impact? Our study identified 3 key sectors. First of all, cooking oil, as I mentioned earlier, is one of the largest sectors in most countries. And therefore, increasing uptake within that sector is very crucial to move the needle. And there are also differences across the 5 markets when it comes to the cooking oil sector. So, for example, in the grocery retail segment, countries such as China, Malaysia, and Singapore have a more modern market with established cooking oil brands. So these would be the ones driving the demand for sustainable palm oil. A good example that we found is the Singapore-based retailer NTUC FairPrice, which is sourcing 100% RSPO certified palm oil for their home brand products. Now for India and Indonesia, where the market is less established and we see non-branded cooking oil as is very commonly used in these countries, it is suggested to instead focus on the bulk market through engaging with processors and traders. Many of these companies are already RSPO members with commitments to increase uptake. Another low-hanging fruit is the hotel, restaurant, and catering segment. Companies including MNCs as well as local firms need to make commitments because they can have very significant impact on the RSPO volume. It is also very encouraging to see a lot of efforts are underway by companies within this segment. So including companies, large firms such as Yum China or McDonald's. Another example is the Singapore-based company Food Services, which distributes cooking oil to hotels and restaurants. And they are also currently sourcing 100% RSPO certified palm oil. So moving on, the second important segment is instant noodle. This segment has a few large players that are currently sourcing high volume of palm oil. We believe that there is large opportunity to increase uptake within this sector, given that less than a third of the largest instant noodle companies are currently RSPO members. We also found that the highest level of RSPO uptake by instant noodle companies headquartered in Asia is about 20%. And finally, company in the oleochemical sector can also play an important role. Now, this sector is dominated by a few players. They supply products to consumer goods manufacturers, which then use that in their branded products. And as a result, we believe that FMCG companies could play a role by increasing or demanding greater uptake from oleochemical companies. Meanwhile, in the non-branded segment, groups such as major hotel chains, hospital chains, as well as commercial property owners can also play a role by increasing their uptake of sustainable palm oil. A very good example of that is Singapore-based Wildlife Reserve, Singapore, which has made commitment towards achieving 100% SPO certified palm oil. So with that, I will end my presentation here, and I think we'll have a couple of minutes for Q&A. And let me also introduce my colleague, Philippa Walker, who has been very closely involved in this study from the very beginning to join me in answering the questions from the audience as well.
Hi, Mei-Lan. Hi, everyone. Nice to join you today. I think thanks again for all the questions that are in the chat, and please feel free to keep them coming. I think there is a few questions there about sources of data and also about how we're calculating more specifically the palm oil product imports. So as Mei-Lan mentioned, this study made use of USDA, UN Comtrade and ITC data, which was then supplemented by interviews from industry experts. And then RSPO ACOP data was used as well to model consumption within each market. And in some cases, proxies obviously had to be used for this, given the level of disclosures that there were available. And as to the question for the palm oil product imports, these were done by searching through HC codes for common palm oil products. And then based on industry interviews, proportionate amounts were then allocated to those volumes coming in to determine the palm oil components of those.
Yeah, and also just to add on to what Pip mentioned earlier, when we analyzed the data on palm imports, we looked at data from databases such as ITC and USDA, and that includes products such as I shown earlier on the slide, crude palm oil, palm kernel oil, palm kernel expeller, as well as palm-related products. And that was one of the interesting findings from the study, which is that when we added up the volume of palm-related product imports, we can see a large increase in imports by countries such as China and India. And you will be able to see a more detailed sources of data in our report as well, which will be published subsequently. So do stay tuned for that as well.
Great. And I saw another question in there about what can consumers do within these markets to promote sustainable palm oil. And I think it's about using the voice to ask retailers for it, look on the shelves for it. We know in many instances it's actually not currently available, but through supporting efforts and raising your voice in public campaigns. And I know in India and China, as we'll hear later, there are campaigns launching that you can add your voice and let companies know that this is something that these markets are demanding.
Yep. Another question that I saw in the chat is that what is the cost differential for certified palm oil versus non-certified? Well, unfortunately, that is not within the scope of this study. So we did not have the specific data for that, but that could be a topic of research or, for future reference. And I do think it's a very important question to ask, given that we are asking companies to increase the uptake of sustainable palm oil.
Great. And there's another question here saying, how does Asia's RSPO consumption compare with other regions? That's something we look to compare, but actually no similar studies have been done to date. A study in the EU has just been looking at food-based RSPO consumption, and their uptake level is around 27%. And equally, there's a study in the UK, apologies, I don't have that data to hand, but again, using quite a different framework than this study. But I think that's definitely a point to kind of look into further down the line so we can do a cross-country analysis. Okay, I think that might be all the time we have for questions as we move on to our panel discussion. But we can loop back to some of, I know there are a lot of questions in the chat, and thank you for those, and we'll try and get to them through typing answers, or otherwise we will jump onto those through the chat. So
let me just hand over to Manola for the panel discussion, and I'll stop my screen sharing.
Thank you both very much for that very insightful presentation, and also a really invigorating Q&A session. Actually, you're only handing over to me for me to hand it back over to you, because Pip, who you've already met, will be moderating our panel discussion. She will be joined by 3 other WWF key experts from across Asia. So can I please invite our guest panelists to turn on their videos and unmute, and Pip, over to you.
Thanks, everyone. So I would like to welcome some panelists from WWF national offices today. We're really fortunate to be joined here by Aditya Bayananda, who's the head of market transformation at WWF Indonesia, Sin Yu, who's the priority project coordinator of sustainable food consumption and supply chain at WWF China, and Bhavna Prasad, who is the Director of Sustainable Business at WWF India. So thanks everyone for joining the panel discussion today. My first question today is for you, Dito, that the trade flow study is showing us a kind of new model of traceability, that through modeling using publicly available trade data, we can develop a picture of who's involved in the landscapes. How does this complement some of the more direct tracing efforts that have been done in some of the landscapes in Indonesia? And how can these foster further collaboration across the industry?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think this really confirms that how important it is, and that how it is possible to be able to trace, or at least have a very good idea of where the supply chains are coming from. And this is so doubly important for buyers and the traders alike, in the context that they will then be able to assess the types of risks that they are possibly encountering, and what are the mitigating actions that needs to be taken. Because like, if we look at the three landscapes that were chosen for Indonesia, like Tesonilo, Sintang, and South Papua, all three of them have very different characteristic. Yeah, like Tesonilo is a lot of it is smallholder, and in Sintang, you have an area where the jurisdiction government has declared itself as a jurisdiction approach, and trying to develop policies and spatial planning to help ensure that any development of new plantations and even existing ones are towards a sustainable path. And then in Papua, you have an area where is still heavily forested, and where the risk is there, where some of these licenses have not yet been applied or been used for conversion. So in all of these three places, you would have a different kind of approach, right? And but it doesn't mean that you don't source from these places. It just means that you have a different approach and mitigating actions to make sure that you are still safe. Your supply chain is still clean. Over.
Right. So just knowing that you're sourcing from vulnerable landscapes, as a company, you can make efforts to ensure that your supply chain itself is a clean supply chain. Great. So Sin, I have a question for you. The trade flow study shows really strong links between China and our priority landscapes in Sabah. What work has WWF China been doing so far to strengthen awareness and connection to further promote sustainable trade with Sabah?
Okay, thank you very much, Pip, for your questions. Yes, actually, in China, we have been kind of trying hard to build the channels for exchanges and the dialogues with the producer ends as much as possible. And actually, we really start well with this linkage between China and the Sabah. This is demonstrated such as with the study tour we jointly organized with our WWF office in Sabah in end of 2019. We bring 15 participants from China to Sabah, including some palm oil buyer companies, as well as some representative from the finance institutes. We have visited the plantations, as well as, for example, the elephant corridors, etc. For representative from China to learn better about how actually on the field looks like. Actually, we find that this part is especially important to bring this topic closer to the demand side, both emotionally and from the more transparent information perspective. And the follow-up is that we have also been working for the consumer engagement and for at both ends, kind of the introducing more of these producers information and the conservation information within China, jointly with working with our offices in Sabah.
Great. I know there's been some really strong links so far, so that's fabulous to hear. So Bhavna, if we move on to the consumption study now, one of the things it highlights is the roles of multinational corporations and local companies in driving sustainable uptake of palm oil in Asian markets. And how is this relevant for the Indian market more specifically?
Thanks, Philippa, and good afternoon to all of you. And you're right. I mean, I think India and Indian companies have a role to play because India is the largest importer, and as the study already showed, the second largest consumer. And overall, if you look at the India imports, almost 95% of our imports are coming from, for example, Malaysia and Indonesia. And 65% of our palm oil actually goes into cooking purposes and 30% for FMCG, or shall we say fast-moving consumer goods like biscuits, chocolates, shampoos, and soaps. So obviously, as a result of that, Indian companies and multinationals are using palm oil and their derivatives in some of these products. So while the import level is fairly consolidated with some of the 5 large importers representing almost 40% of the imports, but the downstream market is fairly disaggregated. And the awareness level of palm oil is very low, and understanding is very low, and sustainable palm oil is even more limited. So in order to address that, we felt that it's very important to develop a coalition. And so in 2018, WWF, along with Center for Responsible Business, RSPO, and Rainforest Alliance, formed a multi-stakeholder platform called India Sustainable Palm Oil Coalition, or ISPOC, in 2018. The purpose of the coalition is to facilitate a multi-sector industry dialogue on sustainable palm oil. It's meant to be inclusive. It's meant to have different stakeholders and even allow cross-dialogue between different standards, in addition to RSPO, such as MSPO and ISPO. The idea is obviously to create greater awareness and commitment for responsible sourcing policies and practices. The good thing is that ISPOC has received significant interest and support from many organizations and has grown to 28 members, representing producers, refiners, consumer good companies. And the idea is to not just work with the companies, but also their supply chain. They're very interested in creating awareness with their suppliers and also in terms of their consumers. So that's something that is very strongly linked. And a lot of that is being linked to the domestic India production and the mills and some of the global companies. So the idea is to build greater alliance there.
Great, yeah, indeed. And I think, similar question for you, Dito, is that how can domestic and kind of regional companies operating in Indonesia follow some of these examples of commitments that some of the multinational organizations within the Indian market are making to further promote the uptake of sustainable palm oil?
Yeah, so I think the study shows that Indonesia is a big consumer as well. And unfortunately, very tiny percentage, 2% or something, is RSPO. So of course that has to change, right? It's just not right that we are exporting this good stuff and just using the basically the other stuff domestically. So in 2019, together with IBCSD, we actually launched this sustainable retail guideline. And if I'm not mistaken, there was eight major companies and domestic retailer that basically made the pledge that these guidances would be used. Of course, these are all kind of a voluntary approach, but I can tell you that in the near future, fingers crossed, there will be one major producer or retailer that will be coming out with a range of products that will be RSPO certified. But let's just let's hope that happens sooner than later, and hopefully then others will follow suit, because I think it's kind of a chicken and egg. Who wants to start first? And when there is these products in the market, I think it will give a chance for us, civil society, and others that are concerned to be able to promote that more actively as well. So we'll see. Hopefully it it will be a good development within this year. Over.
Great. And I think it speaks to that question that was raised earlier about what can consumers do. They can kind of seek out these products, and when they do become available, make sure they're purchasing and showing kind of the commitment towards sustainable palm oil. Fabulous. So Sin, a question for you. I know that WWF works with some key industry groups and associations in China to boost uptake of sustainable palm oil. Can you tell us about some of these industry level initiatives that you've been involved with and how we can target specific sectors as in line with some of the recommendations of the report?
Yes, actually, as somebody might knows that in China, in 2018, we have jointly launched a China Sustainable Palm Oil Alliance together with RSPO as well as China Chamber of Commerce, in short name CFNA, as a platform to support the industry players, to facilitate support industry players for this kind of the commitment and the actions. And since then, we have been trying to both efforts in the recruiting new members and doing the industry research, etc., and doing jointly do some communication activities. And also along the years, we have been kind of either engaged with or kind of organized by ourselves together with our partners in developing these sector guidelines. So currently, actually, there is one China Sustainable the overseas investment for palm oil overseas investment guidelines for palm oil, which is a kind of some guideline look for the overseas palm oil plantation for China that we have been engaged with, and we are going to launch this sustainable sourcing guideline in coming months for industry players to see how to better trade and source sustainable palm oil. And there's another guideline on sustainable consumption kind of the going on that we are also engaged with. So through these efforts, we are trying to, first of all, to build this industry level introductory and general principle based kind of the documents to enhance both the industry awareness and pave the way for further capacity building and to promoting those know-hows to the industries. So we think this is the necessary steps at the current stage, and also especially as you mentioned, that next steps, it will be very important to look into those priority sectors that would have a big influence in the industry and the palm oil trade and consumption.
Great, thanks, Sin. So, I mean, as we've seen in the report, we can see that uptake levels of RSPO within these key Asian markets is around 3 or 4%, so still somewhat low. So including some of the recommendations in the report of industries that could make a big difference and those that could be targeted, what else needs to be done to boost sustainable uptake in Asia? And I'll kind of open to Bhavna first, but then kind of to close this discussion, I'll pass around to Dito and Sin for unique countries' perspectives.
So yeah, sure, Philippa. I mean, I think it requires multiple avenues and different ways in which we need to address this. And while corporate engagement and working with industry is very important, I think looking at this at a policy level, looking at consumer awareness are also two very important components of creating that business case and also increasing uptake at a larger level. So when you look at policy, the Indian government has, for example, signed up for Sustainable Development Goals. And as part of that, SDG 12 specifically speaks to sustainable consumption and production, which is quite relevant for the country at some level. And then India is, for example, also looking at promoting sustainable production in India, though it's very small, but there is an importance of linking some of these aspects together through policy measures, looking at sustainable production, consumption, and trade. So we've in fact commissioned a study which is really looking at what are the different kinds of policy instruments available today, and there are a whole host of them, whether it's eco-labeling, tariffs, taxes, subsidies, purchasing schemes. traceability mechanisms. So there are a whole host of these. And the idea is not to identify or work with all of them, but really narrow the focus down to which are the most relevant to this particular issue, which policy instrument applies to which category, and accordingly define and promote the most relevant one for this. And the idea is for this study to be able to come back with recommendations on which is the or menu of policy instruments that will be relevant, and then accordingly talk to the policy stakeholders as well. So in addition to the policy element, there's also this need for greater awareness of palm oil and sustainable palm oil, which is extremely low in general in quite a few of the markets. And I would say India as well. Overall awareness, as I said, is particularly low in certain segments. And therefore, the idea is to create that through target market segmentation and not really talking to the entire market, so to speak, but overall awareness. And the idea is to focus on the segments that have the greatest propensity to move towards sustainable palm oil. So the idea is to create that awareness and then accordingly build that from an India standpoint. So, yeah.
Great. Thanks, Bhavna. I'll pass over to you, Sin, for what else needs to be done from a kind of China perspective.
Yeah, I agree with Bhavna on these key stakeholders, and besides, I think some other sectors like the finance sectors can also play in a very big role. And per our discussions with these industry players, actually, they're for sure looking for the policy signals and the market demand. However, if there could be more kind of the approaches that is closer to their operations, creating motivations, and that will be a very big incentive for them too. And we actually already seeing some progress both globally and in China on looking for more and more the green investment. So if we can take this opportunity to leverage more finance institutes to kind of the support the sustainable palm oil, or kind of to find out ways to send signal that green finance sector, the finance sector also cares about this topic, that will be also critical to motivate industry players kind of the actions.
Great, thanks. And finally, Dito, what about Indonesia?
Well, first of all, being last means that all of the good ones have been taken by Bhavna and Sinyu, and I agree completely with all of them. I guess what I would add is that in Indonesia right now, actually, there is the government initiative for there is a roadmap and action plan for sustainable palm oil, and that work, I think, is very important, and people should really get behind that. The main theme, of course, is the context of increasing the productivity and the use of degraded and already deforested lands. I think that's super important because, like, for Indonesia right now, I think productivity is relatively still low. There is still a lot of area of improvement on that productivity, and also I think from the government side, creating these enabling conditions like the Sintang jurisdiction, where a lot of civil society are helping the local government to develop like the guidance, and as well as the capacity to ensure that the regulations and policy within the district is actually catered for responsible palm oil. I think that's important in the aspect of getting at the end of the day, like, right, the cost of sustainability down, and making sustainable palm oil as the norm, and in doing so, one of the barriers for consumers, even though we did do this Nielsen study, which says that consumers are willing to pay more, not a lot more, but more for sustainable palm oil, can really get behind on. So I think that this is something that cannot be done just from one side. It's a multi-sector, multi-actor, and everybody needs to come together on this. And I think you know, there's, with the low percentage that we have right now, it should be only to get better, right? And I think that's where it has to go, and I think we're heading that way. But of course, it's not. The challenges will still be there. Over.
Great. Thanks for those kind of concluding remarks. So I just kind of want to open up if anyone has any questions for the panel. Please feel free to throw them into the chat. I'll just have a look at what kind of questions we have outstanding now. There's a question, I guess, around the consumption study of are there plans to publish league tables for the larger branded products showing their percentage use of certified sustainable palm oil. So for now, there aren't any plans from WWF side, but that could definitely be something to look at in the future. Particularly as we've seen with the cooking oils in a lot of the countries in the study, that cooking oils are actually blended with a lot of other oils. So it's quite difficult to just find something that is 100% palm oil. And in most cases in these markets, it's not even labeled as palm oil in itself. So that would be quite a challenge to do so, but more visibility around that would definitely play a role. There's a question here for Aditya. What are some of the prospects for Indonesia in addressing the land conflicts associated with palm oil production and expansion? As BNP say, there are thousands of such conflicts, and NGO studies show how deep-seated these conflicts are.
Yeah, you know, Marcus actually knows more about this than me, but but thank you for the
him.
yeah. Thank you for the question, Marcus. So I think there's a unique possibility, right? With of course, everybody's worried with the new omnibus law that it would actually allow more deforestation and so forth, and whitewashing. But with a lot of monitoring and a lot of kind of the Indonesian term is pendampingan. Yeah, I don't know what's the English term for that one, but you know, working on partnership with civil society, there could be opportunities there, especially in the context where smallholders are in conflict with the private sector. On the other hand, on the other stuff, I think that there is still a lot to be done, a lot of homework, especially in the context of when we're talking about indigenous people's rights. I think that you know, even with the new wave of new laws, in practice, it's still quite difficult for indigenous people to be formally recognize their land for management, and definitely that, to get that straight, or to fix that problem, will go a long way in the context of ensuring that the tenure of these areas for palm oil and the conflicts that happen on them are comprehensively handled, right? So there is no big quick fix, and trying to fix it one at a time is also probably not the way to go. I think there are still some policies, at least on the context of how it is implemented, that still needs to be looked at by the government. Are we giving the same chances for indigenous peoples to kind of assert their recognition and their rights with as long as with the other stakeholders? Again, Marcus can answer this way better than myself. So
So he put you in the hot seat. I'll
Yes, he did.
give you a break. There is another question for Indonesia, but firstly, I might throw to Sin or Bhavna. There's a question in here from Kamal. Thanks, Kamal. About, is there merit in exploring the options of bilateral government-to-government agreements for the import and export of palm oil to reach 100% CSPO over some period of time, be it 10 years or others? So I don't know, Sin or Bhavna, if you'd like to address that.
Sure. I mean, I think that the whole point of that study is primarily to see if there's ways in which there can be different instruments. It could be even a bilateral agreement, or it could be something which is more of a regional trade agreement, or it could be a very specific bilateral instrument that could be explored. So I think we can't set aside. There are already conversations happening at a government-to-government level between India and Indonesia and India and Malaysia. But of course, those are already developing and they are happening as we speak. They already have MOUs in place, in fact. It's a matter of what the market demands, which will also sort of drive where the uptake really comes from. And because it's also related to another question that was posted about whether there's recognition of MSP or ISPO in these consumption countries. And sometimes at the consumer level, the awareness isn't there about some of the government-led mechanisms. There's much greater awareness, for example, regarding RSPO, but not about the other mechanisms, and they're not even available in the market as yet. So those are some of the factors that will define how the uptake happens.
Yeah, indeed. Sin, I don't know if you have anything to add to that, or if we put Ditto back in the hot seat.
Not much from my end, but I think it's like I agree with Bhavna, and actually, in the end, it is the market behaviors kind of for all these tradings. So I think from policy perspectives, there could be multiple ways for sending these policy signals as well as these bilateral collaborations. So I think we are yet on the road to explore. Yeah.
Indeed, great. So I think we only have time for one more question, and I'll put this one to Dito. Thanks, Nan. Nan is saying Malaysia and Indonesia also have their own certifying bodies, MSPO and ISPO. Do clients recognize these, or are mostly only recognizing RSPO?
That's for me?
Yes.
Okay. Just to be clear, from our perspective, I think these mandatory certifications do have a positive function, because it does raise the floor of the whole industry at one go. Even though in the context like RSPO, they may the standards may be higher in the context of the requirements and in the context of how due diligence is done. But I think there is a positive effect of ISPO and MSPO and other regulatory systems. I think from our perspective, at least in the context of ISPO, yeah, it is mandatory. It is in the context of legality, and every buyer out there should always have kind of these guarantees of legality, especially understanding that even in government data that was published in 2019, that around 3.5 million hectares of palm oil is actually grown inside forest designated areas, which means that these potentially are all illegal. So it is a good benchmark to help to kind of reduce the risks of actually promoting these bad behavior. So I for one, and I think can say that WWF is supportive of the context of these mandatory certification and regulations that try to bring the standard of management to a higher level across the board. over.
Great. Thanks so much, Dito, for that final answer. And I think I might just hand back to Manola, because I think we're almost at time for the webinar today. But before I do so, I just want to thank all the panelists, Dito, Sin, and Bhavna, for coming on and kind of sharing your views today.
Yes, thank you all so much. We have now reached the end of this very first palm oil webinar. Please tune in for the next webinars that are planned for May 27th, June 1, and June 3rd. We really hope you have enjoyed the presentations and the discussions that we had today, and we hope to see you very soon. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.